that this is going to be published. And yeah, welcome everyone at this very special Token Engineering Meetup. In these very special times, please don't forget to mute yourself so that we can hear the speakers clearly. We will have 4 talks today, lots of time for Q&A and discussion, so feel free to raise all your questions. Some notes on token engineering maybe before we dive into the talks tonight. So I don't know, I think most of you have heard about token engineering beforehand, have been part of our events or initiatives. So the aim of the token engineering community is to establish a new engineering discipline. So watching the economic effects of COVID-19 now during the lockdown period, we have a growing attention on measures to spur off the economic activities after the lockdown again. And we have threats for local economies as well as global economy. And actually, we don't know what will be the result in 6 months or 1 year's time from now. So with blockchain tokens, looking at it as an atomic unit of information, we can basically design economies from scratch. So we can design new economic mechanisms, and we can somehow build data-driven economies. And the local currencies we want to introduce today, or purpose-driven tokens, are 2 examples how you can apply it. Now, the aim of the token engineering community is to establish rigorous methods for the designing of such economic systems, for the design, for the modeling, for the analysis, the implementation and the steering of such systems. And we organize meetups, we spread the news in our Twitter channel, we provide education material, and we organize exchange between academic research and practitioners in the blockchain sector. I will post some links to the chat in case you'd like to read more on that and you'd like to join some of our other channels. And tonight, there's not only the meetup, it's also the day where the next round of Gitcoin grants have launched. I think we will hear about some of the latest Gitcoin grants a couple of times tonight. You can support the work of the token engineering community via Gitcoin grants. I'll also post the link and take a look at what we are planning in the next round and how you can contribute. Okay, now let's start the meetup. We have an amazing lineup of speakers tonight. And I also have to admit that this is an amazing journey preparing this meetup, because imagine when we first talked about, okay, let's introduce Will Ruddick's work, Grassroots Economics in Kenia. We had this great project together with Red Cross, improving the distribution of development aid and support from Red Cross in Kenia via blockchain local currencies. What an amazing project and a real life use case, right? But now it's March and suddenly we are finding ourselves in a completely different situation. And wherever you look at, be it in Germany, be it in Italy, be it in the US, people are asking the question, oh, what are we going to do with Corona, with all the effects we are facing now? And are there any measures we can take, or how can we apply what we have been working on over years to our real life situation and all the problems we are going to face in the next month and years to come? So we, luckily enough, so the dark side of this, it is that this topic has become so much more relevant for every one of us, no matter where we live. But on the bright side, there is that we are seeing so much activity around this topic again, which is brilliant. And so the Will's talks, it's not the only one we have here tonight. We have Grassroots Economics, the Red Cross Project, community inclusion currencies as the general concept of linking local currencies together. This will be the topic of the talk number 1 from Will. Then Shermin Voshmgir will be next. She originally wanted to talk about the Vienna token, which is a project of the city of Vienna and the Cryptoeconomics Research Lab in Vienna, but she will also tell us that there are changes due to Corona and what are their plans on local currencies at the moment. Then we have a third talk, Julio Linares, founder of Circles UBI.
Dan, can you mute?
Yeah, can people mute when they're not here?
Yeah, can you please all mute? Okay. Can you please? Okay, I'll mute everyone, and yeah, hopefully it's better now. Okay, was talking about Julio Linares, founders of Circles UBI. He's doing basic income on the blockchain and just launched his alpha version of the app, and will introduce his project. And then last but not least, we will have DIGGI, der dezentrale gemeinschaftliche Euro. This is a German project, as you can notice. It's the decentralized cooperative euro. And this is actually a project that has been part of a hackathon just this weekend from the German government, a hackathon particularly conducted to work on Corona projects and support and ideas how to deal with this situation. I think they had 15,000 applicants, and happy to learn more about the results of this project and also their next step and how our community can support this. And as mentioned, we will have time for Q&A after every single talk, and then after the entire presentations, let's have a discussion on what could be next and how you can contribute and join those initiatives and support those initiatives as well. Okay, so now let's start with Will and Grassroots Economics. So Will, you founded Grassroots Economics, I think in 2008, and back that time, this wasn't a blockchain project, I guess. You launched, I think, first version were paper vouchers in 2010. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the general aim of grassroots economics and how your journey from 2008 until today.
Sure, thanks for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, it's perfect.
So I started getting into community currencies back in, it was about 20 years ago, and there was a lot of attention on these things. I mean, not in media, but in circles around permaculture and alternative economics, and people were creating paper vouchers, they were circulating them, and there was this really long history going back to World War I, World War II, and it even goes way farther back than that, of municipalities and local groups creating some states currencies, and I was just fascinated by it. I left my PhD in physics, got into economics, started doing a lot of this modeling that maybe we'll get into tonight, and I started a hedge fund in Forex trading for a while there, just to sort of understand what was going on. That didn't help at all. It was fun though. And then I started working with community currencies in and around the US. I got to see Berkshire's quite a bit. That was probably the one that sort of taught me a lot about how these things work. And there was Let's going on at the same time all over the world. And I basically kind of came to the conclusion that these things were not, at least they weren't made for where we were in the US at that point. Like there wasn't really this sort of chronic lack of a medium of exchange going on. Most of these currency systems were more like social networks, and they were sort of fun, and the majority of the items being traded on the networks were things like back massages, and they weren't really integrated in any way into commerce. Anyways, that's kind of, in a nutshell, what brought me into Kenya was the idea that, well, could these same ideas be much more effective in places where they didn't have a medium of exchange due to seasonal volatility, or droughts and famines and political violence. And so, long story short, I came to Kenya with the Peace Corps, and I started printing little paper vouchers like these. Businesses would come together. I would basically go and meet with the local chief and the elders in the community, and as many of the business people as I could. And I said, well, look, guys, here's these examples. We looked at like Curitiba in Brazil, and we looked at Berkshires, and we looked at the Weir, and we looked at Let's, and we would just have these group sessions with all the businesses in the community and the elders, and to say, well, if we print, X amount of these and we hand them out to everybody in this community, as much as we can anyways, and starting with the businesses, what could be possible? What could be traded? Could this help? And this was in slums, a lot of places where there's a lot to do, and there's a lot of labor available. It's just that no one's willing to pay for that labor, or there's just no money to pay for certain things. And so there are a lot of goods and services on offer, and there's a lot of demand. There's nothing to meet those two. Essentially, in economics, we would imagine prices to be pretty elastic in those situations, but they're actually not. They're fairly fixed. And so you just end up with a lot of market stagnation, where the market runs very, very well for a few days after, let's say, Friday paychecks to casual laborers. And then by Tuesday or Wednesday, it just kind of crashes again. And then that's also true seasonally, and there's all sorts of cycles. And so I did a lot of work with researchers, just tracking those cycles and just kind of looking at, what would we expect the changes to be? This kind of, is there a sort of a consumption smoothing effect? Is there a counter-cyclic effect with the national currency? So as there's less national currency, do you use more of these? And there was some evidence from that from the Swiss Weir, from WIR Beer Bank and Switzerland. And so that was kind of the experiment, is, let's just try this, with open hearts and see what would happen. And so that first example, it was called Eco-Pesa back in 2010. We had about 75 businesses, and it ran fairly well. We had quite a bit of circulation, and kind of, a common theme from all of this was, what is the fundamental backing of the vouchers, right? And the ultimate goal of all of these was to say, well, can we get business groups or individual businesses or cooperatives to self-issue? And, when we're going around and having to print pieces of paper, that's not so easy, right? How are they going to actually self-issue? What does that mean? And what's their profit motive for doing so? Is there a profit motive? Is there, what's sustainable about that type of system to enable it to keep going? And so in our case, when we very first started, there was a donor that wanted to support waste collection in that area to prevent malaria from spreading, because there's a lot of water that gets in the plastics back then. And so all the businesses would come together, and they would get everyone in the entire community to come together and collect all this plastic, because during those events, this donor would come around and give anyone who collected and sorted recycling 5 shillings worth of these. Okay, so like 5 cents. And so we would get huge amount of people there, and it was kind of a fun event. And then those vendors, the businesses that were the ones already trading these, they would come out and sell the products. So it was a great way for they mobilized the entire community to do this work, knowing that they were going to get these vouchers. And then we would have a kind of staged buyback of the vouchers over time. And so that was the first iteration of that, and that ran for about a year, and we collected like 5 tons of waste, and it was, something like 5 times more than we could have done with the money itself, right? If we had just used the donor fund. So that was kind of, okay, cool. That worked. So can we do it without the donor funds kind of was the next sort of iteration of that. And that's when we started Paisa. And in that case, we got all these community together and we issued these vouchers and we said, okay, well, there's no donor funds. You guys are just backing them yourself. You guys can set up, if you guys want to do events and whatnot. And it was much more sort of driven and pushed towards these kind of community groups in those communities to self-run it. And then about 3 months into that, it was going quite well, actually. And people were starting to try to bribe the police with it because the police would catch people as they were crossing the railroad to try to take them into the jail and bribe their family until they paid to get their kids out of jail and stuff like that. So they were trying to pay with these vouchers, and it was a time during Al-Shabaab and all this stuff. And so the central government came and put us all in jail and said, you're a secessionist plot. We ended up, the Attorney General came out and said there's no law being broken here, because if there was, then a lot of other businesses would be illegal that deal with vouchers in different ways. And so we got this sort of like right to continue in a way, like the fact that we were not illegal, and also, the fact that we were not taking money from anyone either, right? There was no profit being made or anything like that, right? And so we were helping the community. There was a big hubbub about, why would you stop this woman from essentially trading her tomatoes for school fees? So anyways, long story short, we got to the point where we started spreading this paper systems around Kenya, and then we started trying to go digital back in like 2015. We were trying to use even Bitcoin back then, but we just, the interface and connecting it into, the biggest challenge was trying to connect these USSD feature phones as a front end into some blockchain as the back end. And it ended up being simpler just to use a regular old database. And so we used a system called Cyclos back then. But even the cost of interacting through the telecom was way too high back then. And so we kept kind of using the paper systems and a little bit of digital back then until we got about to the end of 2018. And I had been reading about this Bancor protocol for some time, and it really just struck a chord in terms of, well, can we put collateral, can we put backing on the blockchain, right? Can people know what's behind this piece of paper or behind this digital currency instantaneously without an audit, right? So if we think about currency, we can say, well, in some ways it's always kind of like a share, if you think about it like a stock market share, right? But we just don't know what it's a share of. So the euro is a share of, the European economy, and you can pay your taxes with it, but what's really sort of behind it is a vague concept, and which is not necessarily a bad thing. And the same with US, like the US dollar is backed by, taxes and the military and all this kind of stuff, but we don't really have a measurement tool of what that is. And so the idea was that, well, what if we just create a virtual token as this reserve, and we divide it out into all these communities around Kenya. So they all have a common reserve, and that would give them tradability. So at that time, we already had something like, I think, 11 different currencies that we were printing actually like different pieces of paper for. And it was, not really very sustainable in terms of like, that to do any more than that was just gonna like break us in terms of having to keep printing this stuff. So it was, I definitely wanted to go digital and have some way to connect these currencies together. And, to do any kind of like centralized exchange between these currencies or any sort of like auditing process is just, way more overhead than we would ever have the ability to do. And the idea of having, thousands of these types of currencies around just Kenya, we needed some sort of automated system, some automated kind of market maker. And so the Bancor protocol basically
has a question. Sorry. So what, these different currencies, what were they backed? You said you backed them with some value?
Yeah, well, okay, so initially it was really just the goods and services of the community with some support from donors in terms of like we would go into some communities and help them build like a maize mill. So one good example of this is a community called Miani. There's a farming community, and in that community they didn't have a maize mill, so we got some support from a Green World campaign. It was another like environmental NGO, and we built this maize mill. So we brought in this machine, you know, it was made from China to, you know, grind the maize into flour. And that service was the fundamental backing of the currency. So it got issued out into the whole community. Everyone could then come and bring their maize to be milled there. They knew that they could always do that. And then the business would pay
and
their...
What was issued? Could you be a little bit more specific? So how many tokens did you issue to whom and when? Like, was there a purpose? Would these tokens be issued upon certain behavior? And was there a limitation? I think these are the very interesting questions, right?
Sure. So we do use a similar system that we do actually even right now today. So any user that signs up to the system, they're issued $4 worth of tokens, or 400 shillings worth of tokens, or 400 tokens literally, and they with no criteria whatsoever. And then they can use those tokens at those places. Those hubs, we call them chamas, which are like groups in Kenya. They collect them, they issue them out back into the community for labor. They issue them out for loans, like not loans that like where the interest goes back into the user's account. So there's a lot of this like tabletop banking. So basically there's like main nodes that collect the currencies. The currencies are just issued out to everybody is in it with a blanket amount. And that's about the cost of feeding a family for a day. So that was sort of our figure on, you know, how much to put out there. And so the main idea behind that was just to say, well, okay, if we can pump the value, the amount of currency in those communities, can there be more trade in those communities because of that? How much circular trade can we get out of those? With the minimal amount of effort on our side in terms of, you know, like, because we don't necessarily have donor funds to do X, Y, or Z, right? So can the communities actually self-mobilize and use these as tools to start trading with each other? Did I answer your question?
No, not really. I don't know, but maybe it's hard for me to understand. So I want to understand, like, so you basically, it was like helicopter money to everyone would get a few of those tokens. And then they could do what? They could spend it for institutions that would accept them.
Yeah, and primarily each other.
Okay.
And so think about the state of Kenya is that, like, you know, 90% of the businesses you see out here are, you know, sole proprietorships. It's just one person running them. These are like little tiny shops, or a woman doing hair for kids or taking care of kids, or, you know, farmers and that sort of thing. So they all do tend to trade from each other to some degree, especially when you go into rural areas more and more. So there's no like big giant supermarkets. I mean, they're there, but most people are using these small little kiosks.
Okay, so these tokens that you would issue, they would are they limited in duration? Do they have an expiry date? Yeah, are there any limitations as to spending those tokens? Did you see, and why would you need different kind of money systems or token systems? Because you said eventually you had like 8 or 9 different systems. What was the reason behind that?
Yeah, so we played around with like some of the early vouchers. Even we had expiration dates on them, and we've also done things like you know, consecutive vouchers that would have like stamps that you would stick on them. Similar to this kind of concept of like demurrage you might have heard of. And, you know, my experience with that is that it just makes the money less and less attractive and less valuable to people. It's like you're handing them sort of a rotting carcass and saying, you know, this is valuable, but get rid of it very quickly. So it makes vendors very unwilling to accept it in general. So, you know, that might work better in a situation where it's, you know, people are accepting it just for the sake of, you know, it's a social benefit. But if they're actual businesses that are, you know, barely surviving, if you hand them something that's going to expire, it's a bit hard. So what we do right now is that we look at the centrality of the user, and we actually reward, kind of like UBI, but we reward how connected they are to the network. So rather than, like, let's say, rewarding volume or transactions or something like this, we actually create a net reward based on how connected you are. So for instance, if you're trading with 5 different people uniquely within a time period, let's say a week, and you represent, let's say, 5% of the network, then you get right now 5% of that time duration's reward. And that reward is right now based on donor funds, but the idea is for it to be based essentially on like a voted on local taxation system. So it's kind of like saying, you know, can we create some kind of UBI based on a taxation system within the community that they can vote on, and then make sure it's distributed fairly and can't be gamed. And there's a minimum, you know, you have to trade a minimum of 20 shillings for it to be counted as a connection into the network. You can't trade like 1 shilling out to everyone. And so that's kind of, go ahead.
I'm sorry, do you have documentation on this that we could read later? Because I feel that it's a very detailed and complex, like sophisticated system that you have built over time, and you have been doing this for a while now. Have you documented your learnings? Because this would be very interesting.
Yeah, there's a white paper on the website. That's pretty thorough. And then there's GitHub for all the various code parts and stuff we're using. So, but yeah, I think fundamentally the main issue that I'd like to just talk about is the idea that as we're adding tokens to these networks, the reason we're adding different tokens is the whole concept is that, you know, me as a business, if I want to issue one of these currencies, you know, what is my motive for doing so? Why am I issuing this, and what is it actually backed on? And I think in the you know, like when Angela started talking about, like, you know, in this world of creating tokens, we can all just sort of instantly create new economies, and it's kind of not really true. Like, all of our currencies that sort of exist today are sort of like these organically grown things. You know, they don't just sort of pop out of the blue. I mean, it's interesting when they do so. So like when Bitcoin came along, there was this, you know, like this discussion early on of like, well, should it be backed? You know, should it be like based on, let's say, like teraflops or like protein folding or something like this? And the argument was, well, how could it ever go up 16,000% if you actually backed it on something, right? You know, so this idea that like you can create a currency and just say, well, let's not really back it on anything, is a lot of like, when I first got into this issue of like community currencies, that was sort of the idea, is like saying, okay, we as a community are going to create this kind of credit space for everyone, and if one business in that credit space decides to stop accepting it, you end up with these traffic jams just constantly, right? So if the perceived backing or whatever it was, this unaudited sort of trust in the network breaks down, well, then the entire network becomes screwed. And so like in the last 30, 40 years, you see thousands of community currencies popping up and dying, right? Over and over and over. And it's almost always the same exact lesson. It's that if there's nothing put on the table, there's no stake, right? Then these things just die over and over and over. And so there's a good example of this group in Japan that is one of the few surviving out of hundreds and hundreds that started in Japan not that long ago. And it's a bunch of elderly Japanese who go up a mountain, they cut some wood, they have this kind of ceremony of thinning out this kind of really dense forest. They sell that wood for yen. They put the yen into a local community bank, and then they make these little like wooden chips, okay? And then they spend those chips in the community. the community accepts them because they want to support the elderly. The chips have a circulation amongst themselves, and businesses can always go back to the bank and take out the reserve, right? What was actually there. And it works. It works very, very well. It's 100% backed in that case. And it's, everyone completely understands it. There's no question of like what's behind this, right? And so I feel like this is the problem with the sort of token world right now, is that we're constantly creating tokens, and we have really, really loose sort of guidelines on like what's actually behind them. Mostly there's sort of like loosely shares of companies, like the ICO craze and stuff like that. And there's no real definition, and there's no connection, there's no agreement, there's no protocol that actually connects them together. And so this is why I got really into this idea of bonding curves, right? So if there's a bonding curve that says, okay, look, I'm going to put some backing behind this thing, and I want to create an algorithm that's an automated, market maker that determines how many tokens I issue and what are the value of those tokens based on what's actually behind them. And what's actually behind them is on chain. It doesn't have to be BNT, with Bancor. It doesn't have to be DAI. It can be anything. It can be any token we decide it is. And so that it sort of separates out this concept of credit, right? Credit space versus reserve space, right? Where in one side,
maybe this is an awesome example, I guess. I remember that you wrote an article on how you designed this bonding curve and the reserves for your community currencies. I don't know if it's possible that you share this article, because there are some nice graphics in there, which I think can help also the people who are listening to better understand why this funding of the collaterals are so important, and how you design the mechanisms.
Sure, yeah.
I also, Will, I have some questions if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it.
So I'm just curious about the growth that you've seen in the network for different merchants in Kenya, and maybe how value creation in their networks has also created maybe some sense of sustainability in their own microeconomies. And maybe I'm also curious about like transacting amongst different communities. So how much,
Sam, I think we've lost you, but we will remember your question. And first we'll introduce the funding, and then second, let's talk about the effects. Okay, so give everyone the opportunity to understand what we are actually talking about.
Sorry, my audio, my laptop is just all messed up.
No worries. We will come back to your questions in a second. So Will, here's the screen on the formulas, policies, and control on the platform.
Sure. I just say one real quick thing to Sam. We started the end of 2019 with like a few hundred, I think about 400 users, like mixed with very small groups in different communities, and we're up to 12,000 right now. And so that's maybe 400% growth, and that's without any we're kind of working on in the next these three equations here are not complex to derive, and in there, there's sort of an additional kind of map. The contracts can kind of go into a little bit maybe, but essentially the three policies are your share price, so your exchange price. I use the term shares here because I was giving a talk comparing these two to shares. This would be called like the converter, that is basically kind of managing these equations and holding or owning that reserve that's been put in there. So you're an issuer, you've put in some reserve. Let's do the example of like, I'm a bakery and I've put in $100 and I'm going to issue 400 tokens as shares. So my S there is 400. Okay. My sort of target reserve ratio F, this is something where if I set this to 0.25, which is 1/4, and I have 100 on top and 400 here on the bottom, and I have 0.25 there, then my share price starts at 1. Okay, there's a little bit of like kind of policy in terms of what those share prices be. If you look at that F in these equations below determines the shape of your bonding curve. It's essentially how leveraged are, right? You're going to get a lot of volatility in your bonding curve. Right? If I want to, let's go down to redeem some of them, right? So I'm going to burn them, I'm going to destroy them, and the converter actually owns, he has the permission to burn these tokens. So these what we're calling nowadays CICs, community inclusion currencies, are essentially kind of like shares of this reserve, and we can basically burn them to pull out some of the reserve. And the way this equation is set up for redemption is the more I pull out of my reserve, the less and less valuable my pricing will be, right? So basically, let's say I'm burning 100 tokens, my supply, I'm going to get back, let's say like 90 of the reserve, okay? And then the next time I burn some more, I'm going to get out 80. The next time I burn some more, I'm going to get 70. It's going to keep dropping and dropping and dropping. So imagine your reserve is like a house, and you're pulling out pieces of wood. So your share price is dropping. So anyone who has shares in that house actually gets a reduced value based on it. And then vice versa. So at that time when the share price is very low, it also means that it's very cheap to buy it, right? So if I add reserve at that point, I'm going to mint additional shares, but I'm going to mint additional shares while growing the overall share price. Okay, so basically issuance in this case, as I issue them, I actually grow the value, and I'm doing this along a curve, right? So as I go up and down that curve, I'm changing my pricing. And so the idea is to be sort of an honest version of fractional reserve, right? So a fractional reserve bank, right, what they do is they have some unaudited amount. Let's say the regulation says we're supposed to have 10% reserve, right? So ideally you've got, Federal Reserve, notes in your bank, you've got dollars there, and you're issuing out credit on top of that, okay? Well, what happens when that reserve drops? Well, actually no one really knows, right? Until it's usually too late. So in like Kenya, we've had 4 banks collapse in the last few years because they're issuing huge amounts of credit to themselves. There's actually no reserve behind it whatsoever. So if you were to do the same thing with this system, you would say, okay, put in your dollars, whatever you want your reserve to be, and you can go ahead and issue credit, but don't call it dollars, right? Call it Wells Fargo bucks, call it whatever you want, but it's not really dollars, it's your credit, right? And as you start removing the reserve, well, if that reserve is on chain, well, then we can actually determine a share price, right? We can determine the price of that credit instantaneously. And so that's the beauty of this idea of a bonding curve, is to say, look, we want to have an ability to issue credit, right? And we need to know what is the value of that credit at any moment, right? Not only that, but I can create an entire credit system. So I can have Sprint bucks, Wells Fargo bucks, and they're all interchangeable, right? Because as let's say I've got, I've got Will bucks, and then Shermin has Shermin bucks, right? Well, so as I burn my Will bucks and I pull out, let's say, the dollars behind them, and I put them into Shermin bucks, well, my value drops and Shermin's value goes up a little bit, right? She now has a price advantage if she wants to buy back from me. And so that's exactly what we do between communities. So each community has the ability to trade with each other. They create trade imbalance, and that trade imbalance is mapped onto their price, right? So they have an advantage now to buy back from each other, right? And so that's how the market basically stabilizes those prices, right? And so what is the fair way to create a currency? In my point of view is, look, if we don't have any sort of reserve system or any sort of protocols, because you could also have hierarchies of reserves, you could have mountain ranges, different reserves around the world that could be connected to each other. But we need some sort of protocol that sort of connects them together. We can have different equations here. Like, not every currency has to have the same equation, but we need some sort of system that connects credit systems together And anyways, this is working fairly well for us right now. There's a few things that don't work very well. That is, like, let's say we have a community with a reserve of $100, which would be like 10,000 Kenyan shillings of DAI, okay? We're using XDAI, by the way. So XDAI is a side chain similar to POA. It's actually the same code base as POA. Maybe Igor's here, I don't know if he is. But it's great because it's almost instantaneous and it costs almost nothing to use. We would have done this on Ethereum, but it was, you know, it was too slow and too expensive to use. So hopefully maybe Ethereum 2.0 comes out. But anyway, XDAI has been wonderful. And so let's say you've got your 100 XDAI as your reserve, and you've got 400 tokens as your share price. And let's say the Red Cross wants to come and put in $1,000 of reserve into that community in order to support that community because of coronavirus. Well, you don't want your price to skyrocket up to 100x the Kenyan shilling, right? And so there's one thing we're working on with block science and the common stack is how to model these curves in different ways, in different spaces. So for instance, can we create sort of like a DPDT resistance? So imagine like a low pass filter, and this is, you know, some of the work of Michael Zargum and the guys at Block Science at the University of Vienna, where they're trying to basically say, well, okay, if we want to sort of make it more expensive to do quick changes over time to price, well, we can basically tweak these equations a little bit to make that the case. And there's a lot that has to do with batching as well, because you can end up with some front running with contracts like this. So if people try to get in front of your transaction and sort of sell it back to you. And so batching these over time, you know, into chunks, and then, you know, making it more expensive to do, you know, quick price changes, either negative or positive. So if people want to sell off their entire value, you can make that extremely expensive to do if they do it quickly. If they do it slowly, no problem. And so that's one way to sort of stabilize these credit systems. Other stuff we're working on is that these contracts right now are extremely permissioned contracts. So if you're the one deploying this kind of suite of contracts, you basically have full control over it. So like the Bancor network, for instance, is very centralized. They could shut down the entire network at any point. They hold the ability to basically tweak almost anything because they can upgrade their upgradable contracts. And so getting rid of some of that functionality and making them permissionless is another thing. And that also means that we need some way of indexing, kind of like a DNS type system that allows people to sort of say, look, I just created my Shermin currency. I want to allow it to be tradable with all the other currencies. How do we create those kind of public registries systems? So anyways, that's sort of a nutshell on the
Okay,
I
think there already has been some questions on the governance. How is your current governance of your model? Who is making decisions on the target ratio, for example? And what's your vision for the future?
Yeah, well, so I think the ratio, what we're going to probably end up doing is, you know, these are contracts that anyone can sort of mess around with and do whatever they want. The reserve ratio is probably going to end up being a dynamic thing. So based on how much reserve is there, it's a risk parameter, right? So like if you want to say I have a collateral of $1 million or $1 million X, well, how much can I leverage that versus I have $1, right? So if you're leveraging $1 100 times, well, okay, so basically that means if someone cashes out one of these tokens, they're going to basically devastate your reserve and your price will just plummet instantly, right? So you're sort of over leveraged. And so the question is basically to say, you know, how much risk are you willing to take? And on the other side, you know, from our perspective as a nonprofit that works with the Red Cross, how much risk should we sort of standardize? And so, you know, if we're going to give aid to communities, well, we probably wouldn't give aid to super over leveraged currencies, for instance, right? And so, you know, it gets more into a sort of a standards argument, you know, saying, okay, look, we're developing these right now in this way. So we're using a factor 4 right now. And so that's,
Okay.
it's.
But that also means at the moment you are not planning as a decentralized organization making its own decisions on the definition of the mechanisms. It's rather that you're trying to create a standard.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so here's another thing that we're doing. I mean, so there's sort of a path where this, as this becomes something where anyone, you know, on this channel can go right now and develop their, you know, deploy their own contracts, right? And they want them all to work together. You know, there's going to be a, you know, potentially a huge space where there's a lot of different types of tokens that have different, you know, leverages and maybe even completely different equations as well. You know, it's sort of like, there's the sort of like buyer beware, like, do you know what these standards are, and how do we maybe as a community come together and say, okay, you know, this one, you know, this set of smart contracts has gone through this validation and is not insane, right? Or, you know, falls within these bands of risk and tolerance, you know, in terms of a credit system. And so I think coming up with those sort of standards and the ability to sort of validate them. I mean, people are always, you know, these are open source contracts. They'll be able to create anything. But, you know, as we want to, you know, create sort of safe zones or verification or, yeah, just standard bodies on, like, you know, this body of currencies within this parameter space. Yes, these can trade on these networks, right? And here's our test, you know, suite for those. I think that would be amazing. I mean, that's, you know, part of the vision of all of this is, you know, how do we create currencies that can have sort of protocols that connect with each other in safe ways. And so we're doing this right now in an extremely centralized way in Kenya, also because we're doing it on USSD right now, right? So these are feature phones, right? They don't even have their own private keys on their feature phones, right? They have a PIN, right? That is unlocking the private keys that we're storing right now. And so there's a lot of smartphones though in Kenya. We just don't have a web app yet, right? So, and you know, as we look at places like, you know, Southeast Asia and whatnot, there's tons and tons and tons of smartphones out there. That is just kind of waiting for a web app to sort of exist to allow this stuff to happen. I mean, the Bancor web app is great, but it doesn't allow you to create your own. It forces you to, you know, buy BNT to join their network and that sort of thing, right? So it's very, very centralized.
Okay.
So getting out of that, yeah.
All right. I think we should take another 10 minutes for question and answers. And maybe since we have a lot of people in the call, please post your question into the chat and we will try to answer on them in the next 10 minutes. So there was this question, would it be not easier to model and trial this logic on a centralized platform and then decentralize later? Easier to fix stuff centrally if people trust you and your community and ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what we're doing.
Okay. But still, everyone, all various communities are allowed or can launch their own currency, right? But they might be connected.
You know, we're literally in just the middle of sort of opening up that door, even within our own system. So we've done it in a few ways. Like, so in the past, we've gone in and actually, you know, like gone and deployed and created those contracts on behalf of the community. In this next stage, they can actually, even just from their little USSD menu, actually create their own tokens. So that's going to be super exciting. So hopefully that's like even in the next month or so right now. So here's another big thing, by the way, guys. I mean, you know, getting back to coronavirus and you know, the fact that, you know, we're a captive audience, just, you know, probably mostly because of this. Well, the idea that this would be useful for crisis and emergency was kind of, you know, that was also one of the original sort of ideas of this stuff. So like if all of a sudden the, so this is like one of these little simulators here. This is all up on GitHub too. So like, let's say this, can you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
let's say this is, you know, Nairobi, or, you know, your local big city, or wherever, you know, a lot of people are working and that's where they're getting their money, right? So like if this is a village here in the middle, well, if most of the money is coming from that city, and if that ends up stopping, well, what can you do? You know, as a community, how do you actually mobilize? How do you support one another? And how do you do it in a way that can be trusted by everyone, right? And so this kind of gets into the heart of blockchain, of, you know, mutually suspicious actors all creating currencies. You know, how do we agree on value of the currency? And so this, you know, gets into this is all, you know, this has the bonding curve built into it. So you can see, you know, there's several different currencies interacting here. There's all kinds of different businesses. But with aid now, so like, you know, if money stops flowing into that community, right? What happens? Does the system simply break down, or is there still some sort of lubrication? Does it still, you know, is there still some potential circulation in those communities? And so what we're doing right now is that we've got locusts in the country right now for quite a while. They've devastated all the crops. Food systems were not good anyways. You know, a lot of we're actually exporting about $5 billion of food to Europe, or at least we were as of last week, and now we've almost completely stopped that. The entire flour industry is gone now. So there's some hope that maybe Kenya will start feeding itself. But I mean, that it's a huge task, and you know, it's not really even being looked at, because there was anyway so much money being made by this export business, that was where most of that money ends up in Europe, and so does all the topsoil, and so does all the water. So now that that's gone, there's this, you know, there's a potential chance for Kenya to start really thinking about feeding itself.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's a scary situation, right? Because there's no way to quarantine people here. There's, you know, like you get middle class, upper class people quarantining themselves, but the rest of Kenya has no food in their house. How can they quarantine? You know, and so they're trying to shut down markets right now, and there's huge riots and all this stuff. So we have all this data. We have all this data coming in, and the question with Red Cross is, how do we support local food systems using this data? And so what we're doing is basically saying that we will issue sarafu to businesses that are centrally connected into the food supply chain and the health system. And Red Cross will basically buy back those tokens from these groups. So as they funnel into these groups, and so that's basically saying, you know, what is the mechanism for essentially pumping aid into these communities in a way that potentially will build more resilient local economies. So that's what's going on right now. Yeah.
I think that's something we will come back in the other project presentations as well, and love to hear your comments there. I'd like to pick up some questions in the chat. From this question on, is this a centralized system? There's somebody asking, Lee, curious if Hyperledger has been considered as a core technology downstream. Can you comment on that?
No, we're just, you know, it works where we are perfectly. Like you know, we get your requests from like, why don't you use this blockchain or this blockchain all the time? And it's just like, please just shut up, you know, like stop asking us that. It's really irritating. And
why did you make your choice like that? I mean,
because it was cheap and free, and then they helped us use it. Good.
That's it. Thanks. Next question. Endogenous money. Wait. Endogenous money requires governance and trust in governance. The previous iteration, Paisa, was much more endogenous, similar to mutual credit. So why did you change, or do you feel you've changed it?
No, it's just, the idea is like, look, if we're creating endogenous money, as in like, we're just going to a community and saying, you guys are going to create a credit. The question is, what is it based on? And so, you know, these systems like Paisa, which are using the new systems quite happily now, they had no way out of that system in any way other than, you know, through X local business. And if that business decided to go on a vacation, the entire system would just shut down. So we had constant traffic jams, if you can imagine, right? So the idea of having some collateral behind it, it doesn't have to be national currency again, right? It could be a store of maize that everyone puts maize into, but you know, adding some national currency as collateral is not a bad thing. And you know, here's one thing is that people, I think, you know, have this romantic idea that they're going to issue a currency and it's like, oh, it's not bad like the US dollar and euro that's backed by military and blah, blah, blah. But the truth is people survive and trust that. There's an entire ecosystem built around it. So why are you trying to sort of create an entire separate ecosystem, right? People, I mean, at least in Kenya, they just want to eat and survive. They're not trying to like create an alternative economy, right? That's not the point at all. The point is just like, how do we survive? And so I think, you know, these things being, you know, created with like let systems and mutual credits in Europe is just, it's a big social fad. And there's no, you know, like the way to connect mutual credits together, it's probably possible with some type of like, you know, common governance where you sort of audit and you decide, you know, what's the trade imbalance between these. But you know, creating an automated system like this that just says, look, if this community is absorbing a lot more than this community and now they're out of balance, therefore their price is changed, and that's just totally automatic, that makes my life so much easier. And I think it makes everyone's life much easier. You know, granted, we need to agree on what those protocols are.
Okay. Next question. There are a lot. Have you considered using XDAI at the level of the community to keep the currency price stable?
We are using XDAI. XDAI is the reserve that we're working on right now. Yeah.
And the second question from Samuel, what approach are you taking to educating community members and users of your platform? That's an interesting one.
So we've got a staff of about 12 people, and most of them are just on the phones all day, and they talk to people all day. They register people. They help people reset their PINs. You know, we can reverse transactions if they send to the wrong number. And so we spend basically, you know, 99% of our time at least just doing education in communities.
Okay. Another question, what is your opinion about the effects of a fully collateralized versus a partially collateralized community currency?
I think this is sort of almost a philosophical question, because I in some ways I consider what we do fully collateralized. So even though, you know, we're essentially leveraging reserve, the idea is if that's just a collateral pool and it's really backed by the issuers and the businesses, you know, within the community, then you kind of you really do sort of have a fully backed, because with the bonding curve, you can never pull out more than the reserve, right? So as as I'm cashing out these tokens, I'm going to get less and less and less value, right? I'm pulling out the reserve behind it. Well, it makes it more, you know, there's an advantage to buying back into these, but in some ways we can say we're not really doing monetary expansion here, right? We're actually just saying, here is some reserve. We've created X amount of shares of that reserve. We haven't told anybody, you know, that these are worth X amount. No, in the bonding curve, it's like every single token has its own price, right? So as I'm cashing them out, the value starts to drop. I mean, if we think of it as shares, I think it's actually a lot simpler if we think of currency as a share.
Okay. Two final questions on grassroots economics before we move on to the next talk. First one is it true that Danish Red Cross is donating 1 billion a year?
No, I wish, but I mean, so, you know, all of Red Cross donates about $1 billion a year. I mean, I think their entire budget is something like $30 billion a year, and then their cash aid is about $1 billion. And they have about like 1.5 million employees. I mean, it's a huge, very interesting kind of franchise of an organization, you know, across the world. But you know, their real goal is they don't really know the impact of their money. It's really hard to measure that stuff. So if they're dumping money into communities, well, first of all, who are they giving it to? It's really hard to decide that. And it's a horrible thing. Like you go to a village and you say, well, why didn't we get the aid? and the next village got all the aid. Oh, it's horrible. I mean, aid is a really horrible, or a thing to be in, because it's just, how do you do it in any sort of fair way? It's impossible, right? It's pretty much impossible. So the idea of saying, well, can we use systems like these in order to target aid, more surgically, and even just like the act of being a stakeholder is a very different concept of aid. If I am going to put money into that reserve and I'm going to mint currency, well, I'm actually a shareholder in that economy now, right? I can donate those tokens out to the community. I could hold those tokens. I can move them to other communities. So it really changes sort of the mindset even of the humanitarian aid, of saying, well, okay, we're looking at actual metrics. We're really looking at actual economies, and we're going to actually help support them. And like if I'm looking at this simulation here, and let's say this is simulated data, but let's say I'm looking at the real data, and we have some really cool dashboards coming out for the real data, and I want to support women who are doing work in education, and I want to see the impact of that, and I want to see the actual transactions moving around. Well, I can actually do that. I mean, that's totally different. Aid has never worked like that.
Yeah.
There's never been that level of kind of transparency. I mean, granted, we are hiding personal information, right? So what's on the blockchain is just public information, but we don't know their names and phone numbers. There's some stuff that in our database that we do make public. So like gender is public, business category is public, generalized location. So we make sure there's no, personal identifying information in there, but still there's a lot of information. I mean, it's huge.
Maybe this is a good opportunity to also, I don't know if you have the link, I think you open source part of your database so that people are also able to analyze the data.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, so right now literally it's just outputting a bunch of CSV files with like hundreds of thousands of transactions in them. And so those are, if you go to grassecon.org/research, I'll post it later.
Okay.
You'll see that. But in the future, I mean, that's not going to work. I'm not going to be able to make CSV files of that. And so coming up with solutions on what to do with all this data, I mean, on one side it's on the blockchain, but there's also this metadata, right, about the users. So that is a big question. We've been talking to people like Gravity.Earth, Johannes, and IXO, and what's a way that we can give ownership of the data to the users, where they can actually say what they want to do with that data.
Okay, so this is a next level of a digital currency, providing data and then make it accessible, or grant ownership of and decision-making rights on what is going to happen with this data. There's a final question that I want to pick up. Is there a direct relation between the community culture and the bonding curve design? What are your findings about this?
Not yet. I mean, right now we're just, it's fairly one size fits all. I mean, the shape of our bonding curve is the only one we've been using so far. In terms of, the main shape is about that leverage. So we're doing a leverage of about 4x. I think there could be a lot of that. And again, like that leverage issue, which deals with the shape of the bonding curve, it should be, or very much, it's tied into the sort of the risk. So that is like, what is the nominal transaction, on your curve, right? So if your reserve space is this big, oh, sorry, you guys probably can't see me. But if your reserve space is so big, here, I could start changing this. Yeah, there we go. There's my example. If your reserve space is this big and your typical transaction, over the last year is this big, well then, you have less risk of moving that price up and down drastically, versus if, you have this much reserve and your price movements are like this, you end up with huge amounts of volatility. So that's kind of the stuff we're playing with. And that's also, why the modeling is super important. So, this is a little kind of cookie. I made this using, Pygame, but we're starting to work with CAD. The block science team is getting involved in making much more robust and larger simulations, so we can model a 10,000 users or 1 million users, and different currencies interacting over the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, all of this stuff really should be modeled, as much as possible. I feel like in economics we don't do nearly enough modeling on this type of thing. So.
Brilliant. I'll post the link you just mentioned, Grassroots Economics /research, for everyone interested in what you're doing with simulations, modeling, using the data. So just take a look at the chat and there's the link posted as well. Thank you for the moment, Will, for introducing us what you have been doing over the years and on community currencies. And I think there is still a lot to share and a lot to learn and a lot to discuss. Thanks for the moment. Now, our next talk is Shermin. So this is a pretty different situation. There's the city of Vienna. You launched together with City of Vienna as Cryptoeconomics Lab at the university, a project that is dedicated to a token for citizens that could, and connected to it, incentive mechanisms for certain behavior. So this is the very superficial information. Maybe first, please let us know what this project is all about.
Okay, so I would like to, very interesting. I'm a great fan of bonding curves. I would like to invite you all to, we're trying to create alternative economic systems, yet we're, from what I'm hearing my predecessor explain, is like we're trying to think in terms of limitation. And maybe later we can talk about why things need to be backed by something, or by what we actually, what is value creation. Before I start to talk about what we're doing with the City of Vienna, I need to maybe introduce the epiphany I had one day about a Bitcoin, and the real invention of Bitcoin is that it's like what I call a purpose-driven token. It's not an object of speculation. It's more than just a kind of a distributed ledger that's collectively maintained. It's first and foremost a very interesting mechanism that incentivizes individual action towards a collective goal. And in the case of Bitcoin, the collective goal was let's create a peer-to-peer payment network, and let's find a mechanism to reward individual action in this network in an attack-resistant manner, and that was proof of work. So and that was amazing. But if we go one step back, we can see that what proof of work did is to combine two concepts that were kind of non-combinable before. We had communism and we had capitalism, and they were like two different things. And collective value creation and individual incentivization in the absence of intermediaries was unheard of. And we have that with proof of work. So what I try to do in my work at the Blockchain Hub in Berlin, and then when we later kind of part of the team also moved to Vienna and we started the Cryptoeconomics Research Lab, we're like, okay, so the purpose could be to have a universal state layer and a peer-to-peer payment network or a peer-to-peer computing network. But what if we want to define as the purpose, for example, CO2 emission reduction? And this is what we did with the City of Vienna. The City of Vienna approached us 2 years ago when I started to build the institute, and they said, okay, they're very innovative. They've been doing blockchain stuff for a while, and they're like, okay, we want to understand this token business. So we had a workshop with them, and a full-day workshop, and then we brainstormed some ideas of how we could kind of incentivize community action with a token that could be then rewarded with some services from the City of Vienna side. And so there were many ideas, and we tried to launch a prototype. We decided to keep it simple, and we had the CO2 for culture idea. And the City of Vienna liked it because the cultural department liked it. They said, well, we're the cultural department, we will start this project with you. And we had this partners also in Berlin, they're called Changers. They have been working for 10 years, rewarding CO2 emission reduction with something they called Recoin. That was way before blockchain or like Bitcoin. They didn't even know what Bitcoin was. And they started kind of creating apps for companies where their employees could get rewarded for if they could prove that they saved CO2 emission reduction. So basically, long story short, we decided we will create this app together with Changers. That will be the front end of that citizens can use. And if they can prove that they save CO2 emission with their mobility behavior by walking or by cycling or taking public transport, we have public data that we can then analyze based on their mobility behavior, how much CO2 emission they reduced, and based on 1 kilogram of CO2 emission reduction, they would get a token, and then they could exchange that token for partner institutions. Not the city of Vienna, but like cultural institutions that are independent economic units within the city of Vienna, voluntarily said that they would be participate and give free entry tickets or meet the artists, etc., for different cultural institutions. So the prototype was CO2 for culture, but this can be extended to anything. We started developing this whole thing, not technically developing it, but like the token system. So the token system, this is why I fully agree with you, Will. The question about the underlying blockchain technology or distributed ledger really is, it doesn't matter, right? Because the token design is a socioeconomic question. It's not a technological question. So the question of how to design the token, the behavioral economic questions are one set of questions. The legal questions, or many techno-legal questions involved with that. It's like, is the token tied to your identity? Does it come with an expiry date, etc., etc.? Different legal aspects would apply depending on the functionalities your token would have. So over the scope of 1.5 years, we were designing just the token system with software developers, economists, lawyers, people from the various stakeholders from the city of Vienna, from the front end to the back end, and then the different stakeholders in the cultural institutions. Unfortunately, because of COVID, so we then launched a kind of a closed beta to test it in January. And then COVID happened, which means that A, we cannot incentivize people for mobility behavior because they're all locked in their homes. And B, unfortunately, the cultural institutions are locked too. So for now, the project since 2 weeks is on hold until September. But I would like to invite you to maybe rethink value creation. So what we try to do here is to say that the city of Vienna, or many people, like with the Fridays for Future movement, it has become obvious that, especially in a city, like reducing CO2 emission reduction is the collective value. So why don't we tokenize a ton of CO2 emission reduction, give it a token value, and then see who in the community rewards that value. And I was surprised, like the city of Vienna didn't have its own institutions. It was like independent institutions, like an opera and a theater and a museum. They're independent economic entities. Obviously they have some ties to the city of Vienna. Sometimes they get grants, etc. But they're independent economic entities, and they were very happy to participate in this. And we had, in fact, we even had many other companies from the non-cultural sector who wanted to be part of this, and we were like, hey, we're not there, hold your horses, we're not there yet, we're trying to set up a system here. And it takes a while, because there are many economic, legal, ethical, behavioral economic questions tied to it, and we need to have a simple prototype, test it. And also, like, we didn't do it as the Crypto Economics Institute, but basically project owner really was the city of Vienna. And we as the Crypto Economics Institute, we were maybe one of many institutions, many other universities who were part of doing some research. It was an ongoing applied research project that unfortunately stopped now. You could incentivize other type of actions. You could have a token be created, so proof of CO2 emission reduction could be a mechanism upon which a token is minted. But proof of maybe any type of time banking system could be tokenized. And that could be very valuable in urban or rural communities, because people are already using time banks. The question, we always have the Oracle problem. So where does the data come from and how can you game it? This mechanism design is probably the most difficult. And Bitcoin, proof of work didn't come out of thin air. You know, there were like people working for decades to get to where proof of work was. So if we need a proof of CO2 emission reduction, obviously you can game the system. For example, how can you game the app? By the way, I have the app here, so you could download an app from the App Store. I don't think you can see it, but where is it? It's a very simple app. Oh, it has expired. I'm sorry. It just told me that it has expired. We cannot use it anymore. That's really... anyhow, so you download the app. The app tracks your mobility behavior. But of course you could game the system. For example, one way to game the system would be to put your phone, tie it around the neck of your dog and send your dog or your horse or somebody else on a bicycle, or a friend on a bicycle, like or maybe shake it somehow. So there's always a way to game the system. So you can pretend that you had more mobility behavior than you did, and you can earn more tokens than you did. So we had different kind of mechanisms or different ways to reduce the possibilities to cheat the system, or to make it feasible to cheat the system by limiting the amount of tokens that you could earn at a time, by making the tokens kind of non-fungible and tied to your identity, et cetera, et cetera. So I think maybe what you're trying to do in Kenya is trying to reinvent an old system that we might not need anymore. Because we used to have money as a medium of exchange to facilitate trade, but we can now directly kind of tokenize directly a value. And it's like programmable money, and then we can make it as liquid as we want to based on the functionalities and that we want this token to have. So I'd probably like to close the talk here, because if we deep dive into the mechanism design of this token, we were just really at the beginning of it. At some point, maybe very interesting, in January, we had a meeting with, I think, 25 lawyers from different universities, different types of legal scholars, and different types of also private lawyers from private law firms, who voluntarily were part of this legal design process of this token to figure out whether tax apply, whether capital market laws apply, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So just this process of trying to do the legal engineering of this, not the economic engineering is another part, and the legal engineering is another part, the ethical engineering is another part, and probably the least complex part would be the technical engineering, because we already have token standards, and we have more or less, I mean, the ecosystem is growing, different distributed ledger solutions. But before you go into the technical implementation, you really have to figure out your economic engineering, your legal engineering, and your ethical engineering of the token system that you want to create. And I think that we probably will go towards economies of multiple single-purpose tokens that are very well designed. And we don't need a medium of exchange anymore once we have market mechanisms and algorithms and atomic swaps. And I mean, we're not fully there yet. But I think what you're trying to build in Kenya might be obsolete in 2 or 3 years. Once we have multi-token wallets that can atomic swap, and you have algorithms determining the different types of the different tokens, we can enter a digital barter economy where I can trade my CO2 token against your, I don't know, something else token, yeah, your apple pie token, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Maybe Will, do you want to respond on that? Otherwise, we go directly to questions from the audience.
Sure. Like, let's hope we're still alive in 2 to 3 years.
Okay, but my understanding is, Shermin, you say, okay, it's about the mechanisms.
You're not the only one. You wanted to say Shermin, I know that.
Yeah, no, sorry.
They always do that.
But again, so you say it's about the mechanisms. This is the real innovation here, not replicating.
So I think it's about, the question is about value creation. And I think this coronavirus situation is putting our world upside down, especially in the first world countries, right? Where all of a sudden we see that, okay, so everyone who's into arts or some office job, doing some high level things, it's all obsolete in a situation like this. What we need is doctors, nurses, people who dispose our trash. We need people working in the supermarkets and the pharmacies. They create value in a situation like this, right? So value creation, we're seeing from one day to the other that what we thought was valuable all of a sudden might not be as valuable, and vice versa, right? So in economics, it's about value creation. And we've used money as a medium of exchange to facilitate trade as an intermediary thing. And I think we won't need that anymore. So I think we need to ask the question is, what is economic value? Or what has value to our economic system? If somebody can prove that they saved CO2 emission reduction, we can reward them as a token. As a society, in our community, in our village, or in our city, or in our country, we can come to the conclusion that we were rewarded with 1 token, and a token is exchangeable for, I don't know, so and so much euros, let's say, right? We could decide that, for example, a unit, an hour of taking care of the elderly is value creation. And actually in Berlin we have Alicia, she's still working on the Embrace token, which is basically a time bank for, this could be like, you could, she's conceptualizing kind of what she calls the Embrace token, where you get rewarded with Embrace tokens for each hour of caretaking that you do at home. But it's tied to your identity and etc. So I don't know whether now. So I think we can enter a time where we redefine value creation beyond a time-based or capital-based value creation, because the system we have now is you either have time or you have capital, and your time is worth depending on what your LinkedIn profile says you can do, you know? So maybe your time is worth 10 euros an hour or 100,000 euros an hour. or maybe 10,000 euros an hour. And the spread can be quite wide, but it's linear. And or you're rewarded based on the capital that you have. But why don't we create completely new value creation systems that are more democratic, where we have different value creation mechanisms within the same region?
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's one question from Augusto, which I'd like to pick up, since this is also on the perception of value. Augusto, are you online? Can you raise your question?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was asking more, Shermin, you were mentioning how there's this token for offsetting carbon, carbon emissions, right? And there's a clear value in receiving that token if I am offsetting my own carbon emissions, right? Like I am foregoing some sort of enjoyment, some sort of comfort, and then I'm receiving some value out of it. But how do the other actors perceive that same value, since it's a very distributed common value, right? It's not something that I'm just giving you, like here's a future for your children. It's like something that is kind of distributed in the whole world. How do actors perceive it compared to, I don't know, how I perceive a beer? It just like has that very.
I can just tell you, like when we, it's hard to say because we barely launched the closed beta, and we had to stop it. But we've been talking about this project for over a year and a half, and also the media immediately picked it up, and we were just thinking about it, and everybody already loved it. That was even before Greta's first a Friday for Future movement thing. We started this, and then with Fridays for Future, more and more people started to like what we're doing. So from anecdotal evidence, I can say that along the scope of 1.5 years of working on this project and conceptualizing it and then building the prototype, and I want to stress, building is not technically building it, it's like socioeconomically trying to build it. The anecdotal feedback that we got was very, very, very positive. But obviously this is a valid question, and it might, I mean, the way we built or started to conceptualize this token was very handmade. We didn't have any sophisticated mechanisms and algorithms yet. I was hoping that once this is online, we can then start to maybe integrate some more sophisticated bonding curve mechanisms. Maybe once we have, you need to set out a very simple low-hanging fruit mechanism, and then you can start refining it with more mathematical modeling and more sophisticated mechanisms. But I think this is why I was asking you so much, because I'm really trying to understand what you guys are doing, but I feel that I don't understand what you're doing because I don't understand what you're incentivizing. And maybe we need new systems. They can be, in the last part, very sophisticatedly engineered, right? But in the beginning, it needs to be very intuitive and very self-explanatory. How does this value, is this value created, right?
I would just, one thing to interject is this idea of credit is really interesting, right? It's a promise of future payment. Yeah. And in collateralizing that, the reserve behind it could be anything of value. Does that make sense?
So what would you, for example, so I'd love to hear your take on, for example, the system we were trying to kind of build in Vienna, this incentivizing this one thing, CO2, this one value, CO2, offsetting CO2 emissions. How would you collateralize that, or how would you use, from your experience, what you've been doing? Could you see like a common ground between what we've been trying to start and what you guys are building?
To me, it sounds like your reserve is actually euros, and what you're doing is you're giving people a credit that's essentially denominated in euros. And you're maybe hoping that there's a secondary circulation of that credit that maybe helps promote things, but you're essentially just rewarding people for something. And versus on our side is to say, okay, I'd like to see a system where anyone can create a token, right? And they can create different incentive mechanisms. They can create different credit systems based on different values, and they can all trade with each other, right? So it's a different, you know, like perspective. In specifically in Kenya, I'd like to see people eating and not dying.
Can you give an example? Like, because when you say specific, can you give a specific example so it becomes more tangible for me, for example?
Okay, so one is, you know, just the initial airdrop in and of itself is creating local markets, right? So people don't have a medium of exchange. They're able to trade with each other, right? Some people have haircuts, some people have vegetable gardens, right? So creating a market just in and of itself in this situation is an okay thing, right? It's sort of like, you know, we somehow we have to accept that maybe capitalism isn't that great, you know, and we can create mechanisms in here that disincentivize hoarding, for instance, right? But fundamentally, let's just say, you know, like the entire aid industry is basically okay with the idea of giving people cash, like that. You know, it's not necessarily solving this far-reaching problem, but it's just to say, look, there really is a lack of medium of exchange. So there's that. And then incentive mechanisms on top of that are things that donors can do, people setting up currencies can do. They can create them in different ways. The incentive mechanisms we're using that's not easy to game is centrality in the network, right? If you want to game centrality, well, that's great. Please do, because you're creating an amazing network by doing so, right? If the cost of being connected to the network is at a minimum compared to the reward, then if you really want those rewards, you're going to have to connect to a huge amount of the network at cost, right? That's a good gaming. That's the kind of proof of work that I like about blockchain, right? It's the idea that if you want to put in a shitload of work, yes, you will be rewarded for that, no problem, right? It's a good so those, I really like all these incentive mechanisms. They're fine. I think it's just important to sort of differentiate this sort of like, what's the value, you know, the idea of reserve versus the idea of credit, right? We just want people to have a medium of exchange, the ability to create credit as a future, the idea that we're going to pay this back into the future based on whatever is valuable, right? And that could change, right? You could actually even change your reserve over time. So, you know, this concept of creating an infrastructure for credit systems to connect to each other with totally different values, I think that's what's really exciting about all this. I don't want to impose my system of value on people at all, right? I want people to be able to create their own value systems. And I think that's
how would you solve? So I understand, for example, individual value creation, like, I don't know, the vegetable garden versus somebody producing wheels, yeah? But how would you resolve CO2 emission offsetting with your kind of mechanisms?
Yeah, so
because this is collective.
This is
a collective problem, right?
Yeah. So if you're a state that's collecting tax and you want to use that tax in XYZ ways to reward or, you know, incentivize certain behavior, well, that's, you know, that wonderful. Please do so. Right? And ideally, your value system as a state or wherever you're getting your money is something that's also valuable at all these community levels. And all the currencies can interchange with each other, right? They're all,
yeah, but we're not like a state level. It's like a city just facilitating an app where the app is a market maker.
Right. Can I actually answer this? I was working on a project similar to this,
okay.
But I just couldn't, you know, figure out logistics. But basically, you would set up a partnership with city governments, municipalities, or different groups of, interested groups. You would partner with them, and maybe they could set up something where they could set up maybe a bonding curve function where they collateralize it for you, and they see the value in setting up a carbon offsets market. So as long as you can do the tracking all the, you know, all the information. What I was thinking about implementing is in Boulder, Colorado, is doing basically a project around getting people to bike to work as opposed to drive, and then basically measuring, you know, from point A to point B, and in turnaround how much gas they're saving or how much carbon they're saving from entering into the environment, and then basically incentivizing that good behavior through getting, you know, local municipalities to either partner up and get them to provide maybe like a tax break or you know, rebates or some sort of incentive to get people to bike to work as opposed to driving. But basically what you would need to do is partner with municipalities. You don't necessarily have to be the entity providing that service, but just the application that can do the tracking.
Yeah, but this is what we did. I mean, in this case, the municipality created the app that does the tracking and would have maybe also done more sophisticated market mechanisms, but the market was independent, right? So we were in a very early stage. We had like already 20 institutions that were interested to be kind of part on the giving the vouchers, like kind of giving the entry tickets for the different institutions. But like in this initial setup, it was only 4 institutions. So we tried to keep it, reduce the complexity by having a low amount of players, but we already had that. So I do see this app as a market mechanism and the token as yes, also a market mechanism, and it doesn't have to be provided by the municipality. In this case, it was, right? Yeah.
That kind of circles back to the question that I had. So in that model, isn't it the municipality in the end the like the value consumer, like a centralized value consumer, and then you have like a secondary market of that value?
Well, there is no direct market, but I mean, the thing is, this app would show me that today it would take me around maybe a week with my regular, 2 weeks with my regular behavior to collect a token, a full token, right? To reduce, and I could then redeem the token. In my app, I would have an app store, like a store, where I could exchange the token for a ticket to a concert. And there would be like a storefront of the different service providers in Vienna that are part of this Kulturtoken. It was called Kulturtoken because it was of the cultural institutions. And then I could, for example, select to go and view Peer Gynt in the opera. And I wanted to do that, but unfortunately Corona happened. So, but the Opera House is independent of the city of Vienna. It's an independent economic entity, and I'm a citizen. Obviously, the creation of that app was paid by the city of Vienna through taxpayer money. So it wasn't a grassroots initiative in that sense. Apart from that, and the initial governance rules were determined by the project team. The question was how would, like one of the research questions was like, who would decide in the future how the governance rules of this app would be? Would we open source it? Would it be part of the governance process of the city of Vienna, the city council, or would it be free? Could it be a DAO? Anything would have been possible, but we didn't even get there, right? To decide what the future governance process could have been, right?
Yeah. Okay. There's a final question from Adam, which is also relating somehow to that question. Adam, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, it's quite related to that. I think the Vienna example is saying something interesting about like the relationship between human nature and stewarding a commons, in this case, the commons of the climate. And I'm curious, it seems like it's those cultural institutions that are in a sense funding the commons stewardship of people reducing their carbon emissions in this case. And I'm curious, which is sort of which sort of doesn't have an economic incentive necessarily. But I'm curious, what is it that, why are they doing that?
Yeah, I was
in your model, and how scalable is it? Like, is this sort of just a sort of there are other ways that the economics of this, or the behavioral economics of this, could actually scale, and how?
Exactly. I don't know. That's a valid question, right? So I was very surprised by the level of enthusiasm of these institutions to be part of this experiment, because they didn't get anything out of it. They were giving away tickets for free. And they didn't have to. And we have, for example, Theater in der Wien, which is an opera house. They do musicals, so they're always sold out. So they they used to be always sold out. They have no reason to give away tickets for free. And the interesting part was that when we had the first meeting with them, they didn't say, like, they were not at all interested in giving away the extra surplus tickets. They were interested in creating engagement, citizen engagement. How can we get additional people, you know, how can we engage people who maybe wouldn't usually come to the institution? So they were not at all interested to give out reduced tickets or cheaper tickets or tickets, surplus tickets. They were, many of them were interested to find out, like, in a playful manner, how to play, you know, how value creation could be reinvented. So there was a high level of curiosity. And, but whether it would have been feasible or sustainable, or, I mean, this project hasn't died, it's postponed now, right? So I think we would see in a year or two, if we continue in September, or if the city of Vienna continues in September, and if, for example, then we could answer your questions, but at this point in time, we can't answer them. And I think the scalability question is very valid, obviously, also. This is why I thought that this was such an exciting project to do, because the project owner was the city of Vienna. And the reason that it was a cultural institution, it was just pragmatism, you know? We could have done, like, more and more institutions, and unfortunately I can't say, but there were so many other institutions interested in being part of it, but we said, well, after that we rolled out, you know, this pilot phase, and we tested it, and we tested the behavioral economics and also the impact assessment, right? So one of the tests we wanted to do was there were many behavioral economic questions, impact questions on around behavioral economics, but also like CO2 impact, environmental impact assessment questions. Will people really change their behavior if you incentivize them with a token, or how many tokens do they need to change their behavior? There's so much academic testing that you can do along the way. So we have so little ideas about, I think we're at the very beginning of this new token economy. And what I always found quite difficult ever since I started we started the Research Institute in Vienna. It's an interdisciplinary research lab, and the academics, especially the social scientists, they had this phobia against technology, or maybe not phobia, but there was this wall, you know, like it took us a year and a half to build ties to the ecological economists at our school, to the environmental economists, to the behavioral economists, who didn't even know what the Web3 was, right? Unfortunately, in able to build all these systems and to create resilient models, we do need more than simple market mechanisms. This is why I'm quite doubtful. While I believe in, you know, all these financial market mechanisms, they can do a lot of things, right? Algorithmic these algorithms can help us do a lot of things, but we need the social science in here too. And we cannot just create a bonding curve, right? I don't believe in solving everything with certain market mechanisms. The question is, what are your, what is your purpose, and what are the behavioral economics or the psychological mechanisms and traits and gaming possibilities? And if you have all that data and all that know-how, then you can start creating mechanisms, and then certain market mechanisms could be part of it.
For me, if I can say something that I feel missing from the discussion, or picking up on the discussion, is we have maybe in sort of currency design, and you're talking about market mechanisms and economics and crypto economics, and then you're talking about, there's another element of real economic value tied to the euro. But with the kind of community currency design and the history of currency design, I've never had any good experience either starting with social scientists or academics or economists, but you start basically by talking to communities and identifying need, right? So, and need particularly where there is no existing exchange mechanism. So, for instance, the need you identified in, or you came across maybe incidentally in Vienna, was that the cultural institutions have a need to do PR in a particular way that they find difficult to do at the moment. They want to engage new audiences. So a step in a currency design would be to talk to those cultural institutions and find out what needs they have that are not being met currently by, let's say, financial mechanisms or their existing techniques. And you try and identify maybe a cluster of those needs in an ecosystem in Vienna, where you have this community. So like an early community currency project I did here in London was one where we had young people who wanted to learn computer technology, and we had the elder community who wanted to do gardening projects. And we found that we could bring those two communities together, where people who worked on gardening and the kids who worked on gardening could use credits to pay for courses to learn mobile app design. But it started with identifying the needs in the community, and sociologists and social scientists can help with that, but they're mainly trained in analyzing an existing situation rather than the creative task of going into a community and designing something new. That's
I fully agree here. Yeah, I fully agree.
Okay.
And that also impinges very significantly on governance and the participatory design process.
Okay,
so
thanks. I think that's really important. We just have to take a look at the clock, and Julio has to leave. And I want to give him the opportunity to add another variant to the spectrum of local currencies. So obviously, it's important to keep in mind what objective you want to reach, be it having a medium of exchange if there is none, or have incentive mechanisms. Julio has developed the UBI Circles, and this is a project dedicated to basic income. Julio, your 10 minutes pitch on the alpha version and your objectives with your project.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the space. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Shermin. Yeah, I think so. Circles, for those of you who haven't heard about it before, it's an attempt at making a universal basic income system on the blockchain. So the way it works is that once you enter the system, you issue all of the members in the network issue an equal amount of tokens constantly over time. So right now the issuance rate is 100, and once you enter every day, as a period of time, every day you issue 2 tokens. So the idea behind it is to make sure that everybody always shares an equal amount of the money mass. So like the credits sort of are kind of like in constant expansion. creates a type of demi-rashi type of inflation mechanism to avoid the speculation and sort of try to get the currency into circulation. Now, I am originally from Guatemala, but I am doing this work now in Berlin. I'm actually not a developer. I'm an economic anthropologist. I actually am in charge of doing a lot of the organizational community work around this. So to me, it was really interesting to hear Will talk about his experiences in Kenya and also like all the lets and mutual credit sort of ideas here in Europe. I mean, it's interesting for me because I mean, I spend my time talking to like local farmers, to like like mothers, to caretakers.
Julio, you're hard to understand. Can you put your mic in front of you? Yeah, maybe that's
sorry.
better.
Yeah, sorry.
That's much better. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I was just saying that I spend a lot of my time here in Berlin trying to talk to different people that provide local services, local products, like farmers and so on. And so you get to hang out with very different minded people, more political people, more like ideologically driven people, more social workers, and so on. And it's interesting for me because being here in Europe, you know, as a person from Guatemala, I feel like the sense of urgency in people to do this type of systems is really different. Like as Will was saying, the people don't necessarily lack a means of exchange in a place like Berlin. What they do lack sometimes is like relationships based on care and reciprocity. You know, there's a lot of social isolation without even the corona. So it's a bit of a challenge to try to like set up the systems here. I mean, my aim was always, of course, to like do it in a decentralized manner so that you have some sort of permissionless architecture that can be employed everywhere. So, of course, for me, I would like to take this type of systems to where I'm from in Central America and beyond. But it is quite an interesting challenge to sort of get economic circuits of trust, you know, which is actually what the currency is based on. Is not really backed. It's backed by, if anything, the mutual promises that people give to each other. So more in lines with the sort of thinking that Will was saying, that basically people put some sort of reserve, or like people basically promise to give something uh, for their promises. No, so the idea is to create some sort of common pool of resources in line with pretty much like sort of this grassroots economic view. And to that note, I mean, just to add to the discussion really quickly, I mean, I think what's interesting to me, sort of in the crypto space that I've managed to encounter, is this predominant view of money as only a commodity and not as a medium of exchange or a credit relationship. And this very fact of how people understand money totally shifts the way they design the tokens, or that they make systems to work out, and the incentives behind it and so on. So that's something to bear in mind when thinking about like token design. For circles, I think one of the challenges now, like I'm really tired right now. I was in like 4 meetings today, organizing stuff for the mutual aid groups here in Berlin, and also like you know, mutual economy stuff. Now that the corona hit, people will run out of an income. A lot of freelancers, a lot of people that have no, like, called the precariat basically, are really gonna struggle. So we're thinking about how to set up things like circles, things like mutual credit, things like what grassroots economics is doing. To sort of get people to care for one another, give aid to one another in some sort of egalitarian fashion, not this sort of international development thing, but more like really to make sure that they are not alone in this process, because it will get ugly in a few weeks. So, I mean, now I think most of our efforts are going into this, like sort of how to organize structures of support, and just use this means of exchange as a way of connecting people. Yeah. That's what I got.
First, will Shermin, your response on that? Otherwise, I take questions from the audience. Please put it to the chat.
It sounds great, Julio. I think that's, you know, the priority right now is just, you know, how do we, as people run out of money, what are they going to do? I mean, just answering that simple question of just, you know, in the next few months, if your supermarket doesn't, you know, exist anymore, you have no more cash. Are there goods and services that you can offer your friends and family? You know, can you build networks around that of, you know, mutual value? And, you know, the hard part on our side has been just, you know, what what can you use as a collateral that everyone trusts? And you know, the simple solution for us right now is that, you know, that's the national currency for now. You know, there's just nothing else that we have. So coming up with, you know, in the future, like going into Sherman's kind of more example of saying, like, you know, in the future, yeah, let's create value systems, you know, different reserves that are based on different, you know, like baskets of commodities, like the original, you know, like Keynes, you know, concepts and things like this, where we have, you know, special drawing rights on mineral resources and, you know, the topsoil quality and things like that. But for the time being, it's just saying, well, look, even if you only have, you know, 100, you know, euros in this reserve, and you create, you know, 10,000 tokens among, you know, your network there, well, you know, as long as the cashing out of it isn't too much compared to what the size of your reserve is, you can still have a very stable credit system. And as long as, you know, people are willing to buy into that credit system when it goes down, right? When you know, like, can you create markets that keep stabilizing it? So that's, you don't have to go into that. I don't, you know, with a lot of, like, if you go to this Drupal app that was made by Community Forge by Matthew Slater, there's no reserve there. You can create, you know, just it's not, you know, of course those credits are not going to be exchangeable anywhere outside your network anymore, but you can still create a network of, you know, a few hundred people that trade with each other. So there is a lot of stuff like that out there that you can use. I mean, and you know, just coming up with a token that you guys all decide that you guys can use, that's perfectly fine. You could actually move into an exchangeable or convertible token at a later date. You don't even have to start that way. So that's my take.
Yeah, okay. Sherman, do you want to add from your side? We can't hear you. I think you're muted. Wait.
Unmute. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, all right.
I'm looking for. All right. Yeah, very interesting. So I would like to find out more about the UBI project and how we can create like what we were talking today. I mean, what I presented to you is this kind of on hold project that stopped 2 weeks ago. But what we're discussing today is like, maybe we can, now that there is a demand, how can we create this? One of the biggest people suffering are the small and medium-sized companies, the SMEs, but also obviously the freelancers, right? So some mutual credit system, tokenized mutual credit system, how could we come up with something very fast and deploy it? And that was just the idea that we had today. And then I told the team that we'll have this call. So I'm hoping to meet some people and exchange some ideas so we don't have to reinvent the wheel, the different teams in the different continents.
Absolutely. I guess this is really something I observe in every single channel, be it in the token engineering channel, the CAD channel. People are looking for projects or opportunities to dedicate their knowledge to this issue, which is a pressing issue, I guess, for everyone in the next month. So maybe this is a chance for UBI circles.
I mean, yeah, the easiest thing to do would probably be to tokenize, you know, to have this time banks, tokenized time banks. Time banks are not a new thing. And if, yeah, I don't know, does anyone have experience with time banks? And just tokenizing a time bank, it's just like a ledger, right? It's like entries.
Yeah, I've worked on time banks a lot from the late 90s onwards, and mutual credit and what have you. And yeah, I definitely think time banks can be structured as an initial early onboarding process, which is very acceptable to a wide community. If you've got you do your research and need again, then I definitely think there's a strong need at the moment, well perceived in communities, with people isolating to work together virtually, on projects that are addressing the problems that the community feels, and they might be economic ones, they might also be addressing the social needs of communities in the age of coronavirus in cities. So if you identify that strong need and you get the storytelling and the PR and the community work really strong, certainly starting with the time bank and then moving on to more sophisticated currency layers like a mutual credit after that, tokenizing or not is irrelevant, except for the fact that you get, again, social status, academic involvement and reputation. You get developers involved if you're moving to something which has a long-term future and a future-looking future. But it really starts with the community and the storytelling and the identification of need and the potential for exchanges of people being remotely isolated. And if you start with that, I think there's definitely a global perceived need. And it's really the problem we have to address is how all the people in this Zoom call can work together. That's the core problem. That's always the thing that stops projects. Everyone's on their own fragmented projects, and you have a Zoom, people go away, there are 15 or 20 different currency projects, different architectures, different economic philosophies, and pretty well any one of them would work if you just get a movement behind it. So it starts off with the social community, social building, and then having a path where you involve the crypto economics, the blockchain people, but you also involve the community people in the governance and the design of something that starts pragmatic and evolves over time. So it's really about community first and how we get ourselves to work together. And that's to me always been the biggest problem. You always come across some project and you say, how can we work together? You have some meetings and then it falls apart. So if we can solve the way we work together in a very minimal, pragmatic way, and we identify that need, I think there's a very solid project there.
On that note, Trustlines is raising its hands. Jan has been working over the weekend on the hackathon project, the DIGGI, and he already in the chat made some proposals how UBI circles and Trustlines can interact and can be combined. So maybe it's a good time to take a look at DIGGI, our final fourth project we want to present tonight. Jan.
Okay, I'll pass the word immediately to Marcus, who makes the start for us. Marcus, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Well, hello everyone. Just a short intro from me, and then Jan, who is the professor of economics, will go into some economic details, and afterwards Stefan from BrainBot will share some of the technological details with us. Now, we were sitting there and we imagined that if you're a politician and one of the biggest crises in a century hits your country, and you know who will be harmed and what would help them, but the only things that are at your disposal are bureaucracy or an insane amount of billions of euros, and with all that, no certainty that this would actually help those who get the money or get the resources. And Corona hit so many people in a very, very different way, so hard that it is almost impossible to actually keep track and design the methods and the instruments that would actually help. Now, if we would have a solution, what would it look like, we thought? I mean, imagine that as a politician, that you could give consumers a budget, but where every euro knows where to go, to restaurants, to taxi services, to flower services, and that it doesn't go to Amazon, for example, because this is not what helps this crisis, you know. Or imagine that you could give every type of business that you choose an optional credit line for a very specific purpose, say rent, you know, and you just give it to them immediately without bureaucratic and winded ways of making the institutions work. Or imagine that you could easily distribute vouchers to all small businesses to create, say, online businesses right now, you know, give them vouchers, make it very cheap or free to do it. Or imagine that you could easily make customers buy at these online shops because they're afloat with cash for their purpose that they can only use for that purpose and that would expire soon. So imagine all these things as a politician. If you could make those choices, I think you would make them because it would make a crisis manageable. And on the other side, if you're a business owner, imagine that as a travel agent, people would suddenly rush to your shop and book for September and pay half of it today already. You know, you have liquidity in your bank. And now imagine that these travels in September are automatically insured against the next pandemic. So you're sure you have it. Or imagine that you could give enterprises tax credits to lay off people, and imagine that you make those credits useful for only paying wages, so that you ensure that it's actually done for that purpose. Or imagine that if you have this mechanism where you could basically design care packages with a will of their own, who find their target automatically. And now imagine that everyone could chip in there, philanthropists or city councils, NGO, so that everyone could stuff this instrument with cash to make it work. If that were true, and you could put an aid package together with the power of a bazooka, as they say, and the precision of a scalpel, then every billion of aids would do the work of 5 billions of aid. And although the politicians give us the impression there's unlimited cash, there isn't. Every one of those euros is hard earned. So if you could make 1 billion make the work of 5 billion, you would do it. And if that were true, if that mechanism would exist, citizens would begin to trust the government that it could help when it wants. No matter how dire the situation, the government wouldn't lose control. And I think if that were true, we would be prepared to save the fabric of our society, even if it takes longer, if the crisis comes in waves, if it comes again and again, we would still and always have instruments at our disposal. Now, we wanted to live in a world where that happens. We wanted to live in a world where that is possible. So we put together a solution in the past 3 days, which is an insane speed. And if people ask me, why is blockchain the base technology? Can't we do it in a different way? Probably we could, but we wouldn't have the people. We wouldn't have the people who can push that through in 3 days. So we wanted to live there. We wanted to put together a solution. And it is the Digital Community Euro, the DGE or DIGGI or DIGGI. And we are basically ready to go with a prototype. And in order to share some more of the economic details, I will now give the word to Jan Lüken, professor in Rosenheim of economics, a dear friend of mine, and later Stefan from BrainBot, who shares some of the technological details. And before we do that, you can join our effort. We just heard that many people would like to join those efforts. You can go to bit.ly/DGE-now, bit.ly DGE now, and you can join the effort. We are in the later stages of talking to politicians and the ministries and everyone. There is a realistic chance that this might actually happen. So let's make it work. And here's your word. You have the mic, Jan.
Oh, well, thank you, Marcus, for your emotional words. I think you made the point that it's good to have positive emotions about the DIGGI, and I guess my job is now to explain more analytically what's the concept behind that. Actually, I'm teaching economics. I'm not so much of a blockchain guy. I know a bit about the technology and the concepts, but for the technical things, Stefan is the guy to ask. But I can tell you why that might be a missing link in economic policy as we've seen it. The problem with Corona is that it is somehow the heaviest economic crisis that we had since World War II or even before. And the biggest problem is that it's complicated. Normally, economic crises have either demand shock or a supply shock, right? The financial crisis in 2008 was demand shock because people lost confidence in the value of their money and the value of the stability of the banks. So they lost trust, and we had to stabilize this trust. In the 1970s, we had supply shocks when prices were going up because production became very, very expensive. And in Corona, we have both. The problem is people can't spend because they cannot go out, and because the expectations become worse, and therefore they start to save because they're afraid to lose their jobs. And on the other hand, companies might not be able to produce as much as they want because employees don't show up, they are in home office, or they're sick. So you have two big forces that actually make this crisis kind of special. So you could say, if you want to be pessimistic, and although I'm a convinced optimist, there's good reason to be pessimistic, that the current crisis actually puts together the characteristics of all the major economic crises that we've seen in the past 50 years. So we have everything. We have a recession, we could see decreasing prices, and we have a share crash on share markets. So actually, what can we do about this? We have, as in economic policy, you can choose whether you want to stimulate the demand or the supply side, or you can do both. What we've seen so far is that governments try heavily to stabilize the supply side by giving liquidity to companies, by giving capital to companies that they can stay alive. What we haven't seen so far is a big stimulus package for aggregate demand, mainly because governments haven't decided about it yet, but there could be certain problems with this, because normally when you decide to have a demand stimulus package, it means you give people money or the state spends money. Or you do both. But what happens when you give people additional money? So for example, when you give tax credits out, or you just make helicopter money, just giving people money to spend, people won't be able to spend it on the things they would normally spend it on. You wouldn't go to a restaurant once more because restaurants are closed. You wouldn't go to shopping in your favorite shops, for example, buying new sports stuff, because these shops are closed. So basically you would do online shopping. And when you do a stimulus package, the money would end up where it's not needed currently. It would end up, for example, at Amazon, at Netflix, or wherever else in these internet companies that actually make a good business right now, because people don't know what else to do when they're staying at home. So Marcus and I had this idea that you should create something to incentivize local consumption. So at the moment, many people living in Germany have to stay at home. I'm living in Bavaria. I'm not actually supposed to go out. But let's imagine we would have some demand power that can only be spent in your local stores. Two things would happen. The first thing is you would go for the services or goods that are supplied locally at the moment. For example, you would order more pizza, or you would take the taxi when you go to the doctor and not taking the tram or something like this. And the second thing, the second thing that would happen is that companies, local companies who would actually know that there is a bound of cash, that there's a lot of purchasing power in this local area, would try to get it. So they would start developing new services and new products that you could consume at home. For example, if somebody does coachings or actually guitar teachings and hasn't thought so far about doing it online, now when he knows there is actually money that I can earn when I develop local supplies, there's an incentive to do it. So with this DIGGI, we can do something that couldn't be done before. We can actually make sure that the money is spent where it's needed most at these local companies. Because, and maybe it's good to know or to reflect on where pandemics, as we see them, actually make the most economic harm. In the long run, the whole economy will suffer. But in the short run, first thing, it's restaurants that suffer because people can't go out anymore. Then it's hotels that suffer because people don't go on vacation anymore. Then it's transportation because people stay at home. And it's something like coachings and theater and culture and things like this. So what's important is to give those, especially those companies, trust back that you care about them and that they can do something in order to stay alive. And it's not that the government gives you money for free, but that you can do what you've always done. You can try to make this money. And the concept that we developed actually makes sure that we can achieve an economic stimulus that works like this. And that makes the whole thing quite attractive, not only for local consumers and suppliers, but also for politicians. And we believe we can actually bridge a gap in economic policy that has been there so far.
Okay.
So maybe you just want to have some questions and we answer that, or go into technical details when it's asked. Okay.
Let's take a look at the questions. Augusto, was this a question, the question you raised, a logistical one rather than an incentive mechanism design one, referring to the DIGGI project?
Yeah, so actually to you guys, especially to you, Jan, the kind of the solution you're proposing is a sort of a token, or a sort of let's say like capital injection or liquidity injection that a government can make in a way that we guarantee goes back to the local businesses that are most affected by this, right? But at least from where I'm seeing it, perhaps naively, what I see is that these producers, these local markets, rely very heavily on like physical presence, you know, like
that's the main point.
And that is where like someone like Amazon has the advantage. They have the network, the distribution network that can get to your home anything you need without you having to see anyone face to face other than the mail person. So how do you see this kind of bridging that gap of I would love to have a pizza from like my local pizzeria, but like I cannot face the person, you know?
Yes, sure. Yeah, of course, that's the obvious, the main obstacle towards this. But we are not the only ones that see that problem, that Amazon actually gets a major share. That's a problem that many municipalities in Germany and GC, and many of them have developed or are about to develop at the moment local platforms where the local suppliers can actually offer their things. So when you want, for example, you need new sports shoes, you can look in Amazon what is offered, but you can't pay them with DIGGIs. And these DIGGIs you get from the government for free. So it's actually a gift to you and you can do with it whatever you want. But when there's a local platform, and that's something that has to be developed with the cities and with the local entities, but in many local entities it's already there, or it's in the pipeline. You can look there and see, oh, okay, when I buy it there, I can pay it with my DIGGIs, and then you actually it's somehow for free. So we believe that it's not that hard to have such a regional platform. That's easy to build. Basically, the problem up to now was that the economic situations in many parts and many cities was that brilliant for local shops that they didn't care about internet business, so they didn't need it. But now's the point where they need it, and of course you can. The good thing about the DIGGIs is you can push and pull them now separately. You know? They're pushed by the economic situations, and you can pull them as well, while you say to you, well, when you now move and when you now go to digital business, there's money that only you can get.
But wouldn't the logistical solution make sense to be tackled first? This is like, again, out of naiveness, I ask. And the reason I'm asking is like I'm seeing the same phenomenon in South America, and they have these companies like kind of like Lieferando, but for everything. One of the big ones called Globo, for example, and they are covering both. Like they're solving two problems. They're covering the gap in the gig economy, because like you can just like, if you're a freelancer, you can just jump in there and like make some money. And they're also, you know, like solving the logistics of everything. You cannot leave your house to do something. Like you can just order on that online in that place. So building that, and then like building something like an economical incentive process on top would I would imagine would be the I don't know, maybe I'm again, it's mostly like a naive question.
No, it's not naive. It's actually
probably a local Lieferando, right?
Yeah, exactly. So imagine that, but for any kind of goods and services. That's like that model is super common in Latin America.
So what our solution, what the DIGGIs do is basically we give them an advantage from the get-go. Their products get cheaper, a lot cheaper. So it makes sense to start those platforms immediately, economically.
And there's one more thing, Marcus, because we have actually matching branches, you know. Local stores are hit quite hard, local restaurants are hit quite hard, and local transportation is hit quite hard as well. So imagine your new sports shoes are not brought to you by Amazon, but they're brought to you by the taxi driver, you know, because he has nothing to do the whole day. Although you could have push factors that now there's a regional currency and somebody has a bicycle like Lieferando, and maybe you could also register and say, hey, at the moment, my normal business is not running. Now I'm going into transportation sector, and because the distances are not very far, you don't need a big car to do this, but you just
need local runners. You just need, yeah. I think that's a brilliant idea. This DIGGI like demands the stimulus for a regional currency. It's basically a conditional regional currency, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Or conditional regionally to be spent regional money. And
you can't spend it on, when I live in Munich, I couldn't spend it on a company that's located in Frankfurt.
Yeah. Maybe this is also a good moment for Adam. He was also raising the question, how does this exactly work? Adam, would you want to raise a question?
Yeah, and I think maybe Frederick answered a piece of it, but I'm really curious how it works in kind of the practical details. How does the currency get to the consumers? How do the businesses accept the currency? And then how do the businesses cash out the currency for euros? And how is it, how does the interface with the government work as well? I'm involved in local economic planning in the place where I live in Canada, and also have some contacts in regional and national government. And I'd like to propose something like this that would let us support businesses to quickly get online and start selling things to people who could have some stimulus liquidity support.
I think that's a perfect question for Stefan. Do you want to answer it? Stefan, or?
Yep, I can take that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yep, I guess so, yeah. Yeah, I guess we did a simple thing. We took advantage of the German administrative process. So everybody who pays tax in Germany has a so-called tax ID. Even if you're a kid, you get it once you're born. So we basically create via some to be determined like authorities, create QR codes. You get the QR code sent by mail to you. You just scan the QR code and you register it, and you have a wallet and everything ready and the mobile app, and you can start paying as a citizen. Then for the local businesses, we said, okay, we don't want to waste onboarding time, so it's a self-registry thing. You put up a wallet, register in a smart contract in a registry, and there you go. People can transfer money to you. As simple as that. Once you want to redeem that, we plan to basically pick a few banks, or have a few banks determined by the local authorities or by the government. They transfer your DIGGI, and you get real euros in the normal payment flow. So it should all be fairly quick and easy. And especially giving the onboarding is totally decentral. So someone has to create that letter with the QR code. You don't have to set up passwords, authorities, those CA histories, which you hierarchies, which you would need in central systems. You don't need it. You need someone who has your tax ID from the local IRS office, basically, and print that letter for you, and there you go. The letter contains the QR code, which has a hash of your tax ID in. So no one can fake anything. You get the QR code, and when you scan it, you have to provide a password, which is your tax ID, which only you have. So it's even fairly safe.
Cool. Thanks for that. And how does how I might be interrupting, but how does the localization of it work? How does the how are local areas identified and then the cash out?
The most simple version which you put in on the weekend is basically geo-distancing. So the local business has to put up their geo data from Google Map, one click, and you can paste them. The mobile app or the GPS function has to be activated, and once you want to pay, there has to be below a certain geo distance between your mobile and the local shop, which is a system parameter which can be tweaked later as needed. So for rural areas, we could even set that a bit further, and for dense cities, it could be a bit smaller.
I got a question and a suggestion. Yeah. So we have a blockchain project based on open innovation. We've got a civic open innovation platform, civic.fm. It's designed in partnership with the Gotio Foundation, which is a crowdfunding, a Web 2.0 crowdfunding platform. They also work with DIGGI, which is a participatory decision-making platform for cities, where people can propose ideas. And we've tied that to a blockchain for science peer-reviewed project, where projects can be rated by scientists or by citizen scientists, and you can engage a wide community of people, basically building up reputation on impact assessment of various projects from a financial point of view, or from a science point of view, or from just a citizen point of view. This initiative in our city in Berlin or in London in this time of coronavirus, we think will have impact. And then you can combine the different blockchain-based reputations, and you have a fungible currency which is tied to a smart contract-based grant distribution platform. So the municipality can target funds to initiatives in the city. And then citizens or scientists or community projects or any projects here can say, we've got this great blockchain project or this great mobile app that will address loneliness or will address the delivery platform, and it can be kind of peer reviewed, but it's all on the blockchain as well. So you can start to debate what sort of currencies you might want to evolve over time. But you start with something, again, which is community-based. So how are people who are locked up in a city, what can they actually exchange? What can they do? So there are lots of people at the moment that we've identified. It's partly just common sense, but partly reaching out. That, for instance, documentary filmmakers, creative people who can make videos about the projects. We've got scientists and experts who are at home and can give their time to analyzing the impact or the likelihood or the effectiveness of the project. And we can crowdsource that intelligence and use a token to incentivize that. We can either use a reputation token or we can use a fungible token. It can be based on a mutual credit, or it can we can design that in different ways. And what you're basically doing is saying, rather than just doing a project based on German law with the German website, this is a project which scales across many cities, many countries. And we need to do something that we get together, and we have a network already across a number of cities. So working with a platform like DIGGI or someone who already has a number of communities and a website based around deliberation in cities across 30 or 40 cities gives us an initial basis. This project was designed just for open innovation in cities, for innovation in cities in general before coronavirus. And I'm just putting that out there now to say, one way of targeting local funds is to have these tethered pots of grants, which then communities can use the token economics to generate, to do work that we know that they can do already, given that they're locked up and they're working virtually and they work from home. There's lots of people who can contribute their time researching and writing up projects. There are people who can come up with ideas, and we can crowdfund that, and then we can go out to all sorts of projects and say, put your project on, and this project needs to not just target one municipality in Berlin, but it needs to immediately be something that we can realistically scale out to 10 or 15 cities that are all facing the same problem. And then we can all chip in, and we can all say that project's really good, or the crypto economics of this project are great, but we can't see people signing up to it. We need to start with a simple time bank-based mechanism, or whatever it is. And we need a way that we can work together and pool our collective experience in a way that people can immediately take part, and then slowly evolve the much more sophisticated. So when I hear about the DIGGI token, forgive me if I got it wrong, I think that's exactly what we want, but I can't see it being rolled out in the next 2 months in a way that consumers, citizens, and cities can readily understand. So I think we need to combine something where we can address a real need, like there are lots of people locked up. They can participate in reviewing these projects. How can we get that energy? And then how can we build on the next thing and the next thing?
Okay, David. Maybe many people ask in the chat on a link to this platform to learn more about this, which is definitely important. And then also the question to the DIGGI project. So you mentioned you had this contact to people from the government. You have been participating at a hackathon conducted or organized by the government. What is your impression? What is the result of your conversations with the people there?
Well, the people are extremely curious because they're basically scrambling for ideas to fight this crisis and the waves that are to come. Nobody knows how long this will take. And this is why we looked for a solution that is easy to be implemented. And there will be mistakes, obviously, but we made sure that the only mistakes that happen would still serve the main purpose that we want to pursue and not go against the purpose.
Are there any measures that they announced? I think they announced a support program for the winners of the hackathon. What are the plans here?
Well, I don't know for sure what will happen with the hackathon part. We will see about that. What I know is that this proposal here was made available to the crisis team of the Ministry of Economics yesterday night, and I know that it will be made available to the Office of the Chancellor tomorrow. And we will do some follow-up conversations with people over there. And one of the leading people of the Ministry of Finance will be briefed tomorrow on this project. So things could happen, and they could not. Our goal was to make available an instrument that could work immediately. And there's one thing that is always very important here. We need to have some activation mass, If the government would choose this project to pursue it and distribute cash in that way, they would only and also do it because it would have consequences, positive consequences in the future. You could direct future care packages easily, and you do have a technological innovation that you can build upon. A neutral payment network that you can use for many, many additional purposes. So it could serve some policy goals further down the line. If that is understood and there is enough courage and fantasy to push it through, I can see it happen. However, this project is designed in a way that a municipality can also just do it, or a philanthropist who wants to support his city could do it and could set it up in his local hometown. So we're curious. Obviously, we're aiming at the government for now, but we're curious if this model can be or will be adopted by other areas too.
Okay, cool. So we'll definitely keep everyone posted on the next steps, and happy to spread the news. To wrap up this call, which has been really intensive and really insightful, I'd like to have Shermin will and you guys from DIGGI having just 2-sentence statements on what you would love to see next in this situation. And also feel free for any call to actions for collaboration. Okay, I think Shermin first. You're muted. Wait.
I have to agree with David. We need to work together. There is no point in reinventing the wheel. I very much like this DIGGI project, and I would like to, because like I'm more, right now I'm in Berlin because for quarantine reasons, but being affiliated more with Austria, I'd like to see how we can, I can be the ambassador of this project to Austria and the Austrian communities, right? So I would like to, maybe we can find a way, a channel to exchange, being in touch, all of us. I think we need follow-up projects to understand, follow-up calls to understand better who's doing what and who has which knowledge. And yeah, I think this is probably the first of a series of calls.
Awesome. Thanks, Shermin. Will.
Well, it's good to be here, guys. I feel like I'm hearing the last 30 years all being done over and over again. And you know, there's a guy here, Matthew Slater, in the chat who's seen the last 10 or more years of these types of programs going in Europe, and he's got a great little Drupal app that he's developed, and there's hundreds of communities across Europe creating mutual credit systems all the time. And he can tell you where they're successful and where they're not successful. If we want to create actual infrastructure to connect all those currencies together, the idea of putting collateral on chain is a really key and simple idea. If you can get bonding curves through your head, they link all of these things together. You can still create all the things you're talking about, everything, every value system that you want in there, they can all be connected, right? The problem with all of these individual mutual credits that you guys are talking about, even the DIGGI one, is that they don't automatically connect to on-chain collateral. You don't really know what the value of them is, and you can't connect them to other currencies easily at all. There's no protocol there. So building infrastructure for the stuff we're all talking about so that we can all use it is super important. And in the meantime, use the fucking Drupal app. We don't need blockchain for any of this shit, okay? You guys can just do it right now. You go log into these websites, look up Community Forge right now, create your mutual credit system, use them right now. You don't need any of this, okay? You don't need blockchain or anything, okay? It's really simple. But if we want to create infrastructure to allow anyone to use these things, we can do that as well. That's it, guys. Thanks.
Thank you, Will. And finally, DIGGI.
I'm here as well.
Final sentences. Julio is still here. Okay, Julio, you're next. Your 2 cents on what should happen next.
World revolution, and what Will said.
And second sentence?
And yeah, take care of yourselves. Yeah, and the people around you. Mutual aid is the way to go.
Okay, thanks, Julio. And DIGGI.
Well, first sentence, come and join and help us. This project is designed in a way that many other projects could tie into it. And secondly, there's a lot of material on the link we provided, our page. And additionally, I've posted 2 links for presentations in the comments so that you can download and distribute wherever you like. So come join us, join the effort. This is not the best project that exists, but it is a project that exists now for a very, very specific purpose and has a real chance of happening. So join us and maybe we change the world.
I hope so, or at least I hope we can contribute a little to proving that technology sometimes can produce good results. And I hope this wasn't the last call on this topic. I would be glad and happy to pick up this topic again and see what happens over the next weeks. So thank you everyone for joining. please stay tuned. I will post 2 links here again. One is for the Telegram group, Token Engineering, and second is for our Twitter channel, where you can get all the links collected again as a result of this call. Okay, thanks a lot. Have a good night. Stay safe and stay sane, and thanks everyone for participating.
Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Amazing work, guys. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks. Great.
Bye.
On the hard work, Will.
Bye.